Hello and welcome to the Philosophy of Psychology Week 2. And in this key concepts lecture for this week, we're going to be looking at ancient theories of the soul. Our reading for this week is on Plato and Aristotle, and we're going to look at their accounts of the soul, their theories of the soul this week. We'll be looking at more ancient theories next week, and then we'll move to modern theories and onto contemporary theories. So this theory of mind and theory of the soul is going to occupy us for the next few weeks of the course. So we're going to start by looking at these ancient theories by two ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. So Plato was around 2,500 years ago, roughly. Was born in around 428 BCE, or BC if you prefer, and died in 348 BC or BCE. So he was alive during the classical age of Athens, and he was a student of Socrates. And in fact, everything that Plato writes is actually features Socrates as a kind of main character in his dialogues. He wrote dialogues rather than sort of books, texts, and Socrates is sort of the main character in the dialogues. People disagree about how much Socrates actually represents Plato's views, probably to some extent, but we know there are times when Plato sort of adds his own gloss and his own ideas to the dialogues as well. He founded the Academy, which was an ancient philosophical school in Athens at the time, and the Academy lasted for hundreds of years after his death. Plato's indifference towards death at his trial and in prison hints at his view that the soul is a different kind of thing from the body. So we notice that's a sort of distinctive thing about Socrates, his indifference towards death, and he's seemingly he's very kind of blasé about the whole thing because he thinks, well, it's not me that dies, it's just my body. My soul is not corporeal, it's not made of material stuff, so when I sort of decay and when I die, my soul is not sort of part of that process. My soul will sort of survive in another realm. So that's a kind of what we would call a dualism, a sort of distinction between the material part of us, our sort of body or our physical selves, and our minds or our soul, as Plato refers to it as a kind of different, a substance of an entirely different nature, so not made of physical stuff like the rest of reality. The word for the soul in both Plato and Aristotle is psyche. And of course, this is where we get our contemporary word psyche, and of course, where the word psychology itself comes from. And there's a sense in which Plato himself is really the world's first psychologist, sort of delving into these questions of mental life and the sort of relations between our sort of mental attributes and how they work together and sort of how they conflict and so on. So we'll take a look at his theory, and then we'll take a look at Aristotle as well. So one important question that Plato deals with is the question of whether the soul is simple or complex. Is it made of parts, or is it sort of unified? Is it one thing, or is it different parts? Plato suggests a rule to determine if there are in fact different parts of the soul. He says we can identify different parts of the soul, so there will actually be parts to it, if the same thing cannot at the same time be the proper subject of opposites, in the same respect and in relation to the same thing. So let me explain that, and I'll use these couple of examples here. The same thing cannot at the same time be the proper subject of opposites. It cannot both be moving towards something and be moving away from something at the same time, in the same respect in relation to the same thing. It's often said that the man, so we have a picture here of a man waving his arms. So he might be said to be in motion in one respect, in that he's sort of waving his arms around, but it might also be said to be at rest because his lower body is presumably not moving. It's just his arms that is moving. So here we have a sense in which somebody seems to be at rest and in motion at the same time. So is this like a counterexample? Does this tell us that things can be the sort of proper subject of opposites? Somebody can be at rest and in motion at the same time. But in fact, no, this doesn't hurt the claim at all, because we can say very clearly that part of him is moving, his arms are moving, and another part of him is stationary, right? His legs are not moving. So it's not the same thing that's moving and is stationary. These are different things. His arms are moving, the rest of his body is stationary. So we need to sort of identify different sort of parts of the soul. We need to identify something where in the same respect, right, things can be the proper subject, things cannot be the proper subject of opposites. And if we find those things that are opposites in the same respect, we know we've got different parts of the soul. A spinning top, the second picture here, it might be said to be at rest and in motion at the same time, same as the man waving his arms. It's at rest in the sense that it doesn't incline, right? It keeps its sort of regular, stable inclination. It doesn't sort of incline one way or the other. But it's also in motion in that it's spinning. So again, we could say, well, it's a proper subject of opposites. It's at rest and it's in motion at the same time. But in fact, that's not in relation to the same thing, right? It's in motion in that it's spinning, and it's at rest in that it doesn't incline, right? So neither of these two give us a real sort of counterexample to this rule that says if we can distinguish something that is a sort of opposites, if we can distinguish a movement towards and against, or a sort of motion and rest at the same time in the same respect in relation to the same thing, right, then we'll have identified two different parts, right, two different parts of the thing. Okay, so let's sort of put that idea into practice now and talk about how we distinguish different parts of the soul. So Plato claims that if we experience a desire for something, an inclination towards it, a sort of favorable sort of inclination towards it, and at the same time an aversion to it, a movement away from it, we will have identified two different parts of the soul, right? We'll know that something in us, right, part of our soul is moving towards something, and another part of our soul, with respect to the same thing, and in relation to the same thing, is moving away from it, right? So it's a kind of psychic motion towards and away from the same thing, a kind of conflict, in other words, right? Where at the same time we seem to want something but don't want something at the same time. We sort of want to do something but also want to avoid that thing at the same time. So this is the idea that we can distinguish parts if we have a psychic motion towards and away from the same thing. Okay, so let's look at Plato's examples and how he uses this idea to distinguish different parts of the soul. So we're all familiar with experiences, I think, in which we have an intense desire to eat or drink something. We're really hungry or thirsty. But at the same time, we have a kind of aversion, a desire not to eat or drink that same thing. And this might be for health reasons, right? Maybe we say, well, if I eat that right now, that's not going to be healthy. I care about my health, so I'm not going to eat that right now. At the same time, we might have an intense desire to eat that thing or to drink that sort of that sugary thing that we want to drink. right? So for Plato, this tells us that there are two different parts of the soul in play here. It's the part that he calls appetite. This is often called desire as well as appetite, and I think desire sort of tells us what kind of thing it is. It's the part of our soul that pursues pleasure, and the experience of pleasure. So it's appetite that wants the experience of pleasure. That's the part of the soul that wants to eat, or wants to sort of drink the sugary drink. Excuse me, and it's reason that reminds us of our long-term interests. So it's reason that looks out for our long-term interest in our health, our long-term interest in our well-being, and our satisfaction. And these two things come into conflict when we want to consume something, but also there's a reason for us to avoid it. So here we see the emergence of two parts of the soul, appetite and reason, in these kinds of conflicts. Now, Plato argues that there's a third part of the soul as well. He calls that third part spirit. And it's interesting to see in this passage of the Republic from Book 4, or Chapter 4 of the Republic, where this idea emerges. And it deals with this character Leontius, who was going up from the Piraeus under the outside of the North Wall when he noticed corpses, dead bodies lying by the public executioner. Now there are some sort of old stories about Leontius being sort of attracted to corpses, having a kind of necrophilic orientation, and this comes out in this passage here, in this conflict that emerges. So let's take a look at the passage. So he noticed corpses lying by the public executioner. He desired to look, but at the same time he was disgusted and made himself turn away. And for a while he struggled and covered his face, but finally, overpowered by the desire, he opened his eyes wide, ran towards the corpses and said, "Look, you damn wretches, take your fill of the fair sight. I too have heard it said," he said, that's Glaucon speaking, "this speech," I said, this is Socrates, "certainly indicates that anger sometimes makes war against the desires as one thing against that something else." Yes, he said, it does indicate that. And in many other places, don't we, I said, here is Socrates speaking, notice that when desires force someone contrary to calculation, he reproaches himself and his spirit is roused against that in him which is doing the forcing. And just as there were two parties at faction, such a man's spirit becomes an ally of speech. Okay. So what we're noticing here is another part of the soul, spirit, which is sort of often identified with anger. The word is thumos, which sort of captures this idea of anger as well, this kind of, this kind of emotion that sort of emerges when we feel slighted or offended, when our sort of our self-esteem is threatened. And that tells us a lot about the kind of thing spirit is. It's this emotion that admires and honors those who are taken to be exemplars, who live well. So there's a sort of admiration part of it, and it's like this sort of social emotion, this sort of admiration for admirable figures, but it can also be contempt, as we see here, contempt for contemptuous things. So contempt for people who sort of look at corpses and who want to experience sort of that experience. And we see here in the passage when Plato talks about desire forces someone contrary to calculation, what's going on here is that appetite, so his appetite is trying to look at the corpses. That's sort of the desire that wants to look at the corpses. He wants to take pleasure in looking at them. But his reason here lies with spirit, and spirit is offended by this desire. It's sort of contemptible. Right? It's not a desire that's sort of socially recognized and rewarded. So spirit is indignant about this desire and about this Leontius's sort of desire to look at the corpses. So his spirit is kind of roused, and his spirit allies with reason to try and sort of prevent him from looking at the corpses. Eventually that alliance fails, and he does go and look at the corpses. But that's what Plato's talking about here. It's making common cause. So spirit and reason are sort of allying here, and that's sort of that's Plato's sort of model for how the soul should work, the sort of healthy arrangement of the soul. I think we can see sort of an example of this in, think of something like rubbernecking on the highway as well, where sort of, when people go past an accident and sort of part of us wants to sort of stop and look, but I think we recognize as well, there's part of us that sort of recognizes something shameful in that, and sort of in the desire to stop and look, and we feel something shameful and contemptuous in that desire, and at the same time we don't want to look. So we sense that conflict between our spirit and our desire, or our appetite. Appetite and spirit are in conflict in those kinds of situations. So spirit is about what kinds of behavior are respectable and worthy of esteem and which are not. And it seeks to distinguish itself by earning admiration and esteem from others. So this can be disruptive, right? If there's a lot of conflict and competition around esteem, and people are always fighting on the basis of esteem. But it's also the faculty that admires and honors those who are exemplars, those who are taken to live well. So the question is whether spirit will honor those who genuinely deserve to be honored. And that's sort of the key question for the health of the soul. So reason and spirit, how do we distinguish those? So this comes to pass in this passage here in the Republic, where Plato quotes a passage of Homer here, and it's from the Odyssey. When Homer says of Odysseus, he smote his breast and reproached his heart with word. Right. So he's trying to sort of calm his spirit here. His reason is trying to calm his spirit. And in recognizing that conflict, we see the sort of, we see reason and spirit as sort of separate things that can come into conflict. The reference is to a time when, the reference in this passage to a time when Odysseus, who's returned from the Trojan War, sees one of his maidservants giggling as she goes outside to be with the suitors of Penelope. The suitors have come because they think Odysseus is never going to return, so they're sort of they're trying to sort of win the hand of Odysseus, his wife. Odysseus is outraged and he wants to punish them immediately, right? And I think we all recognize this moment. Our anger is raised and we want to act on it immediately. But Odysseus manages to control his anger by his reason, saying, be still, be quiet, right? If you keep quiet here, we can execute the plan, and that's going to be a better long-term solution than sort of getting angry and acting out at this time. So this is the conflict of reason and spirit. So here we can see we've seen the three parts of the soul and how they can come into conflicts. And that's what tells us and assures us that there are three parts. So this is Plato's charioteer analogy. And this is in the Phaedrus, which we'll actually look at in the hypothesis markup assignment this week. And according to the charioteer analogy, the three parts of the soul are represented as a charioteer. The charioteer is the person in the chariot, is reason, who is supposed to be in charge and sort of directing the soul. And there are two horses, a good and faithful horse, which is spirit, and a kind of unruly horse, which is appetite. So reason has to kind of control the two horses, keep them in check, but also sort of use spirit to kind of keep appetite in check and on balance as well. So for Plato, it's appropriate for reason to rule because it looks after the long-term interests of the other parts of the soul, ensuring physical needs are met and our reputation and self-esteem are maintained, while resisting short-sighted and irrational impulses. In the Phaedrus, Plato talks of spirit in an alliance with reason to keep desire under control. But also, as we will see, desire is essential for intellectual growth. Under the rule of reason, a person maintains a systematic and principled understanding of reality, and their reason embraces a pursuit of this as its essential good. Reason and appetite can communicate with reason, but they are not rational enough to be depicted in human form. That's why they're represented here as horses. Right? It's only reason that is sort of the principle that can be portrayed in human form. So there's something sort of distinctive, something unique about reason, and we'll see that same thought repeated in Aristotle's idea of the status of thought when we look at his account. So the soul becomes disordered for Plato when appetite or desire becomes the ruler in the soul. Reason and spirit are reduced to pursuing and valuing only what appetite itself wants, pleasure, which is pleasure or wealth. So this is typically what happens in Plato's sort of example of a disordered soul. Right? One of the other parts of the soul becomes the ruler, and then what happens is it sort of confines the other parts of the soul to serving its own needs. So instead of looking out for sort of the long-term interests of the self, reason is enslaved and becomes confined to identifying opportunities to pursue pleasure or wealth, because that's what appetite wants. So reason is confined and enslaved and sort of robbed of its usual function of looking after our long-term good. Spirit is also enslaved because it identifies self-esteem and pride and social recognition exclusively with accumulated wealth or pleasure. So it doesn't sort of take the kind of moral attributes of self-esteem and pride, but focuses exclusively on accumulating wealth and pleasure. Those are the things that it takes to be sort of worthy and to deserve self-esteem. And so spirit is also enslaved by desire. So the disordered soul is a kind of hierarchy where one of the parts other than reason, which is not supposed to, one of the parts that are not supposed to rule, become the ruler and then sort of distort the other parts to serve their own purposes. Now, part of Plato's theory as sort of an essential sort of aspect of how it works is this governing dualism between the soul and the body. And body and soul belong to fundamentally different parts of reality. The body uses the senses, the sense of touch, of sight, of hearing, etc., to gain knowledge about the world. But the soul is able to use thought and reasoning to know ideas or forms. Okay? Ideas or forms are sort of non-material forms of knowledge, and they're not related to the body, and they're not related to the way our senses gain knowledge about the world. So according to Plato, the world we live in, the sort of material world, is a poor imitation of the real world, the theory of forms or the sort of world of forms or ideas. Our world is constantly changing, and we rely on our senses to understand what is going on. So, for example, you are not the same person you were 3 hours, 3 years, 3 seconds ago. Our cells are changing and ideas flit through our minds constantly. So what Plato associates with the material world is this constant change, constant becoming, constant sort of transition. Nothing is permanent, nothing is itself the same over time. So Plato was sure that the real world is outside of this material one we live in. This real world is unchanging and eternal. It contains ideas, fundamental truths, where there are perfect forms of the things we know on earth, right? So all the sort of, we might sort of draw a triangle in the material world, but it's not going to be an exact triangle. If we draw it, it's going to be imperfect, right? So the only perfect triangle is the idea, the very idea of a triangle itself, which contains the idea of three sides and angles adding up to 180 degrees, right? So the idea of a triangle is the perfect triangle. All real triangles are sort of imperfect because they're sort of part of material reality. And that goes for sort of every idea. Every idea, every form is perfect. And the things we encounter in the material world are simulacra or copies of those perfect things, poor imitations of those perfect things. Now, Plato seems to think that the soul can be separated from the body. He sometimes uses myths about reincarnation to emphasize this difference. So he talks about souls being sort of, coming down from heaven and being sort of dropped into bodies and then sort of enlivening bodies. He also suggests that the soul survives the death of the body. But it's not entirely clear what survives, given that, as we've seen, appetite and spirit both seem to have kind of physical, material aspects. What is it exactly that survives? Is it just reason? Is it a part of the soul? Is it the whole soul? So, as we will see, Aristotle will criticize this aspect of Plato's account, that soul and body are separable. Okay, now let's turn to have a look at Aristotle's view of the soul. And he develops this account in his book On the Soul. In Greek, it's translated as peripsyches. Psyche, or psyche as we sort of call it now, is the Greek word, as we've seen, for soul. And in this book, Aristotle sort of gives a general theory of the soul as related to living things. So the characteristic feature of Aristotle's idea of the soul is that it marks the difference between the living and the dead. This is important because we often think of, say, a soul, or we'd probably call it a mind today, as marking a kind of difference between the mental and the physical. Right, there are sort of mental things, and then there are sort of physical things. But that's not quite Aristotle's focus. He's focused on the difference between the living and the dead, and the living things of all kinds are said to possess a soul. So plants have a soul, animals have a soul, anything that's living has a soul. And a soul is what animates or gives life to living things. It sort of animates, it's an animator for living things, giving them a kind of a life, a movement, and an awareness, and a capacity for growth and potential. So it's related to living things, and it marks the distinction between the living and the dead. But what exactly is a soul? Well, for Aristotle, the soul is basically a set of powers or capacities that allow the organism to function in various ways. So possessing a soul is like possessing a skill or a set of skills, like the carpenter's skill, for example. The carpenter's skill is not some separable part of the carpenter, right? You can't locate it in a specific place of the carpenter's body. It's attached to her whole body. It's attached to the whole organism, right? It's not a specific thing. It's a capacity or a power, rather than being a separable part. So I think that explains a lot. If we think of it as a power or a capacity that allows the organism to function, that's the way Aristotle's thinking of a soul. Now, this is where Aristotle is going to disagree with Plato, because he thinks that soul and body cannot be separated in the ways that Plato thinks. Souls require bodies in order to perform their functions. So souls cannot exist apart from bodies any more than skills can live apart from skilled humans. Right? You can't have a carpenter skill without a skilled carpenter who embodies that skill. Right? The skill can't sort of live alone and be separate from the embodied person. So this means that souls are like physical capacities. They cannot exist outside of physical bodies. And this is why, for Aristotle, Plato's talk of souls entering bodies is nonsensical. It just doesn't make any sense. Souls can't sort of descend and enter a body at whim, because there's this essential relation between a soul and a body, that they're sort of connected. Souls are inseparable from the body in which they are situated. There's a much closer connection between soul and body in Aristotle than in Plato. Now, a question we might want to ask here is, if souls are not separable from bodies, can they be explained in purely material or physical terms? Well, Aristotle says no. Living things are not simply aggregates of material stuff. They have a principle of unity, and that principle is the soul. Right? So they're not just material things, they're not just sort of or aggregates of material stuff. They provide something different which material or physical things cannot provide. They provide the structuring principle of unity. So living things, in contrast to in contrast to non-living things, are self-moving, what we call teleological, which means goal-directed systems. They pursue goals or ends, and they are self-motivated. They don't require something external to sort of make them move. So this requires a unifying principle, not reducible to the material elements. And for Aristotle, that principle is the soul. So it's not a separable part, but it's also not it's not a purely material thing. And it can't be explained in purely material terms. Okay, at this point, we have to talk about Aristotle's hylomorphism. And the term hylomorphism is basically a combination of matter and form. And the relation of matter and form is really central to Aristotle's entire metaphysics, and it informs his theory of living things as well by extension. Let's first take a look at this quote from Aristotle from the book on the soul. He says, "It has now been said in general what the soul is. The soul is a substance corresponding to the account, and this is the essence of such and such a body." So the soul is the substance or the essence of a body. "It is as if some tool were a natural body, e.g. an axe. In that case, being an axe would be its substance, and this would also be its soul. If this were separated, it would no longer be an axe, aside from homonymously. But as things are, it is an axe, for the soul is not the essence and structure of this sort of body, but rather of a certain sort of natural body, one having a source of motion and rest in itself. What has been said must be considered when applied to parts, for if an eye were an animal, its soul would be sight, since this would be the substance of the eye corresponding to the account. The eye is the matter of sight. If sight is lost, it is no longer an eye except homonymously, in the way that a stone eye or a painted eye is." So there's a lot going on here. Let's try and unpack, right? We're given an example of an axe. And I think we can see the basic idea here of how form and matter is sort of being applied, and we've seen a sort of similar thing in soul body, right? That what makes an axe is its form, right? That it can be used for cutting things. It has a material component, right? It has a sort of material component which is partly determined by what it does, right? It has to have a sort of sharp blade for cutting and a strong handle. But those things are its form, right? The thing that makes it what it is, and not just, say, a piece of wood and a scrap of metal. what makes it what it is its form, which makes it an axe that it can be used for chopping things. Okay, and we're given the example of an eye as well, right? And so if an eye were sort of a living thing on its own, right? Its soul or its form would be sight, right? That's sort of its function or its purpose. And it also, of course, has a sort of physical component, but its form is what it does and what it accomplishes. So this is hylomorphism, and it's the foundation of Aristotle's metaphysics, his attempt to understand what things are in general. He extends that idea to living things on the soul. So when an axe is incapable of chopping, it's not an axe. When an eye is incapable of seeing, it's not an eye, except in name only, right? So the eye of a statue is not a real eye, it's an eye in name only because it doesn't fulfill the function that an eye fulfills, which is to see, to perceive. So the eyes of a statue are eyes in name only, okay? So this sort of brings out this idea of function, right? And the relation between form and matter in how we discern function. So when Aristotle applies that idea to living things, the soul is the form of the living thing, like the sort of being an axe is the form of the axe, and the body is the kind of material component, as the wood and the scrap of metal are the kind of material component of the axe. Now, three things are related here. So we've got a relation between soul and body, which is modeled on the relation of form and matter. And we can also see a third opposition here, actuality and potentiality, right? Where something is a sort of actualized version of potential. As we would say, the acorn is a sort of actualized version of an oak tree is an actualized version of an acorn, right? So we've got three sort of oppositions here that are related. Let's think a bit more clearly about this idea of form, and we can see how Aristotle uses this idea of form to think through what's wrong with both sort of reducing everything to a material level, and on the other hand, assuming, like Plato, that there's a sort of big division between material things and sort of spiritual or soul type things, right? So Aristotle's going to reject both alternatives, right? And this idea of form, a relation between form and matter, is how he captures the relation between soul and body in a way that avoids dualism and a kind of reductive materialism that wants to say that it's just material things here and nothing else. So we can ask the question, what makes a pile of bricks a house? A pile of bricks, the sort of material stuff that makes a house, is not itself sufficient for a house, right? It requires a principle other than the bricks themselves in order to be a house. And that principle is the form of a house, the way the bricks sort of are shaped and structured according to that principle of that form, right? So the matter itself is not sufficient, and this is why a kind of materialism which says there's only the material stuff is wrong, okay? Because we also need a kind of forming element. We need a principle of unity that makes the bricks a house. And that principle of unity is sort of the form that allows the bricks to fulfill this function of being a house. The function of being a house to provide shelter and warmth and so on. But does the house exist then independently of the bricks? Can it survive the destruction of the house? Well, obviously not, right? Once the house is destroyed, once the bricks are destroyed, once the bricks have been sort of, destroyed and burned and crushed, the house will cease to exist. And in that sense, dualism is wrong too. It's wrong to assume a separation of soul and body. form and matter cannot be rigidly separated because the constitution of a living body, or any other body, is necessitated by its form. The house just is the arrangement of its bricks. It's not a separable thing. So we can see where Aristotle is coming from when he rejects the separability of soul and body as we see on Plato's account. Now, just to give an example of one of the sort of functions that Aristotle talks about that makes up the soul, one of the functions he talks about is perception. And he says that it's like receiving perceptual forms without their matter, as wax receives the imprint of iron or gold without the ring. So that's the model, the kind of wax imprint. Right, so when we perceive something, it's as though we receive the imprint, so we receive the form of the thing we see, the cup, the table, without the material sort of form. So the material itself doesn't sort of enter into our eyes, but we receive sort of the form, and so we're able to discern what it is that we're looking at. In some way, Aristotle is saying sense organs like perception, like sight or hearing, must be capable of becoming like their objects. They must be capable of taking on the relevant property of their objects. So each sense is sensitive to one determinate range of properties, whether it be sight, touch, hearing, or whichever sense we're talking about. Now, here's Aristotle's outline of kinds of souls, and we'll see there are three distinct kinds. There's a vegetative or nutritive soul, which is possessed by plants, and this involves the capacity to get nourishment for themselves and ensure the reproduction of their species. But of course they can't reason, make plans, or indeed move around. On the next level we have the perceptive souls of animals. So in addition to getting nourishment and being able to reproduce, animals are able to have senses to experience the world around them and react to different stimuli, and enough intelligence to distinguish between pleasure and pain. And then when we get to humans, we see finally the ability to reason and to tell right from wrong. So the three different categories, and remember they build on one another. So the perceptive souls have the vegetative souls, and the higher degree souls also have perceptive souls. The ability to reason relies on the ability to perceive things, and then we sort of reason and sort of think about what we perceive. So we have to have the sort of lower levels as we advance to the higher levels. Now, one interesting thing that Aristotle talks about is the unique status of thought. And he puts this out there in his book on the soul, whether thought is in part separable from the body, whether it is immortal and eternal. Now, why does he say this? He talks about this thing called the active intellect, which he distinguishes from the kind of passive part of our intellect. And the active intellect, he says, produces all things. It is in essence activity. It's always thinking. It can exist in separation from the body. It is immortal and eternal. But how does this cohere with Aristotle's philosophy of mind and his general metaphysics? Given that as we've seen, his hylomorphic approach to living beings in terms of matter and form, in general, seems to be directed at providing an alternative to Platonic views about the soul. So does Aristotle just sort of revert back to dualism here? Well, it's clear that thought depends on other functions, for instance, perception, that are linked to the body, so how can it be totally separate? But Aristotle's thinking of thought here as sort of something that doesn't rely on sort of bodily faculties to the same extent as the other parts of the soul. It's as though thought can run on its own when we sort of close our eyes, when we sort of separate ourselves from the world. And that seems to be what Aristotle's thinking of here. There's something about thought that seems to be a unique status. And we want to sort of consider here whether this gives us questions for his theory, whether this gives us a hesitation about what he's saying, whether there's a confusion or a conflict here in terms of his general sort of theory in terms of matter and form, in giving this kind of unique status to thought. Okay, so let's have a look at what we've got to do for this week in week 1. So there are readings, as you'll see, in the theories of the soul in the ancient world module. There are readings by Plato, Aristotle, and Stoicism. And there's another lecture here on Stoicism, as well as this lecture on Plato and Aristotle. So make sure you do the readings, do the lectures, and then there are 4 tasks to complete before the end of the week. So there's the hypothesis markup assignment, which is due on Thursday, and that's on the text on Plato, My Soul and Myself by Annas. Make sure you complete the 3 tasks, to do a post, to do a response to a classmate, and to ask a question. There's a discussion board post on Stoicism as well. So you have to write the discussion board post and make sure you reply to a classmate as well. And finally, the voice thread assignment on Aristotle. Respond to the prompt at the end of the video and do a voice response to the prompt. And also you can respond by voice or text to a classmate. So do 2 posts, one a voice prompt, the other one can be voice or text. And finally, quiz 1, which is due by the end of the week. So these are the 4 tasks. When you've completed the readings and the lectures, you can get started on these tasks. Remember, the hypothesis assignment is the first one, then the discussion and the voice thread. Finally, the quiz is due at the end of the week.